Listen carefully, because I'm going to tell you what is about to happen.
You know, I've come to believe that Jesus really might be the Messiah. And the truth is, I still have so much to learn about him. This journey, it's not a one-time revelation. It's something you walk through your whole life. That's exactly how Jonathan Roumie approached his role as Jesus. With reverence, with weight, with every ounce of himself poured into the scenes. But there was one moment, one unexpected turn during the filming of The Chosen that no one saw coming. It happened during the Passover scene, and it left the entire cast shaken, some in tears. It wasn't just good acting, it was something else entirely. So what really happened on set that day? What was it that broke through the script and pierced everyone in the room? Let's go back to that moment. It was Holy Week. The air on set had changed. There was a kind of stillness but charged like electricity right before a storm. Hundreds had gathered for the scene, but it wasn't just about extras or cameras anymore. It felt like something sacred had arrived. Something you couldn't explain, only feel. As the cameras rolled, Jonathan wasn't just stepping into a role, he was stepping into a moment that shaped all of history. He didn't come to set casually. Far from it. He had people surrounding him in prayer. A spiritual advisor walking him through the emotional and theological depth of what he was about to portray. This wasn't just a performance, it was preparation for sacred ground. They were filming The Last Supper. And if you know the story, you know it's more than bread and wine. It's the final embrace before betrayal. The stillness before agony. The last moment of peace before the cross. It's love, wrapped in sorrow. Jonathan felt that, deeply. He took time before the scene time to sit alone, to pray, to reflect. Not just on the story, but on the meaning. The weight, the covenant that was being born in that room. This wasn't just history, it was alive. It is alive. For Jonathan, and for many believers, especially in the Catholic tradition, the Last Supper isn't just a memory. It's the very heart of faith, the Eucharist, the source and summit of Christian life. And on that day, he wasn't just called to reenact it. He had to carry it. He said it himself, this wasn't about getting the lines right. It wasn't about looking holy. It was about surrendering to something bigger than him. Asking God not to help him pretend to be Jesus, but to help him feel what Jesus must have felt. And that's where the moment came alive. He said, for me, it all comes down to one thing, making sure my own relationship with God is right. And in that sacred space, everything else followed. Filming that scene wasn't just intense, it was sacred. Jonathan later said it may have been the most meaningful moment of the entire season, and he didn't step into it alone. Around the table, the cast gathered, prepared for another shoot day. But what happened next wasn't in the schedule. Something began to shift. At first, it was subtle. Then the air in the room thickened with silence. Not the awkward kind, this was different. Reverent, weighty. The cameras kept rolling, but no one was acting anymore. Tears began to fall. Not because a line demanded it. Not because the script reached for emotion. But because something real was happening right there among them. The kind of real you can't rehearse. And it didn't end when the cameras cut. It wasn't just one take or one afternoon. The moment lingered, stretched across days. Each line, each pause felt like it carried centuries of meaning. Jonathan had people praying over him constantly. Intercessors behind the scenes lifting him up. He called it spiritual firepower. And he wasn't exaggerating. He knew this wasn't just about portraying Jesus at the table, it was about stepping into a moment that forever changed the world. You could feel it on set. The tension, the gratitude, the holy hush, like something sacred had settled over everything. Even the smallest movement felt deliberate. Every word, every silence heavy with meaning. Jonathan knew he had to be in the right place within himself. Spiritually, mentally, physically. Because what they were trying to capture wasn't just a dinner. It was the supper. The farewell before betrayal. The moment where the divine met the fragile. Where covenant replaced ritual. And for a few quiet days, the show stopped being a show. The crew felt it too. The lights faded into the background. The script became secondary. All that mattered was honoring what this scene meant. Not just to the story, but to the faith of millions. Jonathan called it a miracle. A moment where everything else disappeared, and what was left was only Jesus. Remembered, felt, revered, and that's what came through. Not acting, not performance, but presence. He said he can't wait to see how it's cut together because it can't fit into a single episode. There's too much, too many layers, too much soul, too much history, too much truth. No one scripted the tears. No one planned the silence. And certainly no one expected the director Dallas Jenkins to sit frozen behind the monitor, unable to call cut. But that's what happened. The actors, some broke down between takes. The crew stepped away, some wiping their faces, others just trying to breathe. And no, this wasn't some elaborate acting method. This was different, deeper, heavier, almost holy. The scenes they were filming weren't just about tradition. They were leading toward the cross, toward sacrifice, toward everything that makes this story more than history, it makes it hope. And for those few days on set, it felt less like production and more like prayer. Something shifted. Before the cameras rolled, Jonathan Roumie along with the entire cast sat down for a full Passover meal. Not a rehearsal, a real one. Guided by Rabbi Jason, they didn't just learn about the tradition, they entered into it. They listened, they tasted, they remembered. And slowly they began to realize that every symbol on that table was pointing forward, not just to a religious ritual, but to what Jesus was about to endure. Dallas Jenkins, the show's creator, had grown up observing parts of the Passover with his family. He's not Jewish, but the tradition was familiar. Still, he said it never truly clicked. Until that night. Until he sat there and watched the cast absorb it, not as actors, but as people. Something was in the room that night. Heavy, holy. Dallas began to understand, really understand what that moment must have meant to Jesus and his disciples. The Passover wasn't a celebration. It was a remembrance of survival. A night marked by blood, by mercy, by death passing over. And for Jesus, it was also a foreshadowing. Because this time it wouldn't be lamb's blood on a doorframe. It would be his. During filming, no one had to fake anything. They weren't acting out tension, they were sitting in it. The heaviness, the ache, the sense that everything was about to change. This wasn't just dinner. This was the eve of betrayal. The moment before everything unraveled and everything began again. Even the cast members who didn't identify as religious, some who didn't believe in Jesus at all, felt something. They approached Dallas afterwards speechless, some with tears in their eyes. They said they'd never experienced anything like it before. And there hadn't been a single dramatic monologue. No soaring music, no flashy direction, just a table. And the unshakable feeling that something sacred had taken place. It no longer felt like they were filming a show. It felt personal. And for Dallas, that was the real turning point. He admitted something humbling, that even after years of reading the Gospels, even after studying this story in depth, as a Gentile, he had never fully grasped the weight of that meal. The sorrow, the preparation, the spiritual storm just beyond the horizon. This wasn't about changing scripture. It was about seeing it again, with new eyes, open hearts, with reverence. Dallas set out to tell this story with accuracy and integrity, but something happened that went beyond script pages. A space opened, and in that space, something sacred stepped in. Not just for the audience, not just for the disciples on screen, but for the people behind the lens too. The crucifixion may be coming in a future season, but what happened here? This was the emotional groundwork. The soil was being turned. The roots were reaching deeper. And for everyone involved, it wasn't just a scene. It was a glimpse into something eternal. From Moses to Jesus, from lamb's blood to the cross, the story had always been unfolding, a thread woven through generations. And in that moment, they could all see it. God had been telling this story from the very beginning. Everything points to Jesus. You can plan the script, block every shot, rehearse for hours. But moments like these, you don't plan them. You witness them. And if you're open, they change you. This season moved fast. Scenes came quickly. The pace didn't leave much room for breath. The cast often found themselves swept up in it all, barely able to process what they were filming, let alone the depth behind the relationships on screen. Even Jesus felt different. There was something unfamiliar in the way he moved, the way he responded. The actors could feel it too. They tried to keep up, but something deeper was happening, something harder to define. It was like trying to act inside a storm. And that was one of the biggest challenges of Season 5, capturing not just the plot, but the spirit of what was unfolding. Elizabeth Tabish, who plays Mary Magdalene, remembered one scene in particular. She called it one of the most powerful things ever written for the women in The Chosen. But it wasn't easy. She leaned hard on spiritual strength just to get through the shoot. People prayed over her. Her spiritual director stayed by her side, because what she had to embody wasn't just emotion, it was reverence. In that scene, Jesus isn't preaching. He's receiving. He sits. He listens. He lets the women care for him. And that reversal, that divine humility, cut deep. By the time filming wrapped, Elizabeth was physically drained, not from the work, but from the tears. It wasn't performance. It was a spiritual experience. That's what this season asked of the cast, not just to tell the story, but to feel it. To connect with Jesus, not just as a character, but as a presence. That connection became even clearer during preparations for the Last Supper. Before they filmed it, the cast didn't just read lines. They sat down together for a full Passover meal. Rabbi Jason Soyle led them through it step by step. Every blessing, every motion, every silence. Not to get the ceremony perfect, but to understand it, to feel it. Even for lifelong believers like Dallas Jenkins, that night opened something new. He said the connection between the Passover and Jesus' journey didn't truly land until that moment. Because Passover isn't a holiday filled with songs and joy. It's remembrance of blood, of mercy, of death passing over. And on that set, that solemnity settled over everyone. The laughter faded, the focus sharpened, because they knew they weren't just reenacting history, they were entering it. The Passover meal wasn't about celebration. It was about survival, about sacrifice, and most of all, about hope. And through it all, something changed. The story of Jesus, already familiar to many on set, took on a weight they hadn't carried before. It lingered, even after the final cut, even after the lights shut down. Paris, who plays Matthew, described it best. He said the emotion came in waves, unexpected, unannounced. There were no cues in the script for what he felt. It just arrived. He couldn't shake the connection. The blood spilling from Jesus' wrists, the thorns pressing into his skin, and the memory of the original Passover. Blood on doorposts, protection from death. Now it all made sense. One wasn't just a historical ritual. The other wasn't just a symbol of sacrifice. They were the same story, told across time, now woven into a single moment. What they were filming wasn't just a scene, it was something alive. So real, so heavy, that actors began to cry mid-take. And not because the scene called for tears, but because their souls responded. Some couldn't explain it. Others didn't even try. Because how do you explain walking into a miracle? They filmed for 6 days. Some shoots stretched past 300 a.m. It was exhausting, beautiful, sacred. One actor shared how celebrating Passover every year had prepared him for this moment. Bringing that tradition to life on screen wasn't just special, it was personal. Every detail mattered. The matzo, the movements, the prayers, the pauses. Time seemed to slow down. The set became something else. A place where you didn't just act, you entered in. Noah James, who plays Andrew, described being swept up by the emotion of it all. He didn't have to act heavy. The heaviness found him. He said it felt like the entire cast had stepped into holy ground. And when they left, they weren't the same. For some, Passover was something they had always known. But even then, this experience made it deeper, richer, more human, more divine. They didn't just rehearse the rituals. They lived them. They listened to the blessings, tasted the bread, moved with reverence. And this is where The Chosen shines. Not just in grand storytelling, but in the quiet, careful, deeply human moments that make history breathe. One actor raised in the Greek Orthodox tradition said he had never truly felt the Last Supper like this before. Not in church, not in study, only now. It wasn't about the big speeches. It wasn't about cinematic tricks. It was about the table, the posture, the hands passing bread, the eyes that knew sorrow was coming. And George Harrison's Xanthus, who plays John, said it simply. Even he, after everything, was overwhelmed by the rawness of it all. Sometimes, the story doesn't need more words. It just needs to be felt. Something changed in the cast. Not just their performances, but their hearts. Stepping into these roles with such care and reverence reshaped them. Jonathan Roumie, who plays Jesus, didn't shed tears because the script told him to. The tears came on their own. When he looked around the table, saw the faces of his castmates, his brothers, and realized what this moment truly meant. It hit him, not as an actor, as a human. He spoke about how a rabbi came to teach them the traditions of the Passover, the hand motions, the order of the meal, the posture of prayer. As an actor, he found it compelling, rich in detail and history. But something happened when he stepped into the scene as Jesus. It didn't just feel studied, it felt lived. Even between takes, the emotion lingered. There was laughter, sure, but it came laced with tears. The cast hugged. Some wept openly. It wasn't stress. It wasn't exhaustion. It was something being stirred deep within them, something holy. Because to bring this moment to life meant asking a question that cuts to the core. What would it really feel like to sit at that table and hear those words? The tension on set was real. It wasn't the kind you can stage. It was the kind that wraps around your chest and stays there. The air felt heavy, as if something divine was pressing in. Each day built on the last, like the whole production was climbing towards something immense. You could feel it. From the very first scene of the season, it was there. That knowing, that sense that something was about to happen. At some point, everyone stopped pretending. These weren't just actors delivering dialogue. These were people standing in the shadow of the cross, carrying the weight of it with every breath. You can't fake that. You can't direct that. What happened in that room was something sacred, and everyone felt it. Jonathan later admitted that reading the script for season 5 brought him to tears. Not because of the story structure, but because of what it asked of him. This season, more than any before, would demand everything, not just as an actor, but as a believer. To portray Jesus in his final days was not a role, it was a spiritual test. The emotions were raw, the scenes unrelenting. He didn't just walk through lines, he walked through something holy and heavy, especially during the Last Supper scenes. And the timing too perfect, too aligned. Jonathan called it what it was, divine providence. Because when every piece fits without effort, when the emotion is real, when the sacred shows up without invitation, you're not just filming anymore, you're witnessing a miracle. When Jonathan Roumie first agreed to speak at the National Eucharistic Congress, it felt like a distant commitment, almost a year away. Something he'd think about later. But time moves quickly. About 6 months before the event, the date circled back on the calendar, and suddenly it wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real. And it clashed with something major. Filming for The Chosen. Jonathan rarely steps away from set once production begins. It disrupts the rhythm, the continuity. Even a few days off could feel like too much. But this wasn't just a scheduling issue. The moment he saw the overlap, something else stirred. He couldn't explain it except to say it didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt like it had been arranged from above. What first seemed like a problem began to feel like providence, because the scenes he had just been filming weren't random. He had spent the week immersed in the Last Supper, in bread, in wine, in the sorrow and weight of what was to come. And now he was being asked to speak about the Eucharist. Not weeks later, not months down the road, but right now, while it was still fresh, still raw, still sacred. Jonathan described it like seeing the two testaments come together. You hear about the connection your whole life, old and new, promise and fulfillment. But it's only when you live inside that story that you feel it. And then suddenly, it all makes sense. One of the most powerful moments in season 5 came early, Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. It wasn't just another dramatic setup. It was a moment that shook everyone. They had over 600 extras on set that day, lining the path, waving branches, shouting praise. Hosanna to the Son of David! As Jonathan walked toward the gates, the chants grew louder, echoing through the air like thunder. The sound wasn't just noise. It was worship. It was joy and longing converging in real time. He felt it in his chest. So did everyone else. George Harrison Xanthus, who plays John, brought it up later, reminding the cast how electric the atmosphere had been, how alive it felt. Because it wasn't just a scene being filmed. It was a new way of seeing the story, a view we've never truly experienced, until now. Most versions of this story are told from Jesus' perspective. But The Chosen, it's called The Chosen for a reason. Because it's not just about him, it's about those he called, those who followed, those who wrestled with doubt, fear, hope, and still chose to stay. And in moments like the triumphal entry, even Jonathan Roumie stopped acting. He wasn't imagining what Jesus might have felt. He was feeling it, the sound of the crowd, the voices crying out, the weight of what was coming. He later said it hit him all at once, so fast, so fierce that it knocked the wind out of him. The world of the script vanished. What was left was a man on a road riding toward his fate. And for a few sacred seconds, something outside of him took over. He wasn't trying to perform. He was just trying to stay present, trying to carry that overwhelming wave of emotion into the scene. Because what Jesus must have felt, hearing those praises, knowing what awaited him just days later, you can't fake that. You can only surrender to it. Jonathan always understood the weight of playing Jesus, intellectually, but living it is something else entirely. With every season, the role grows heavier, not because of the lines, but because of the layers. The more the story unfolds, the more Jesus reveals. And that emotional gravity, it stays. There's not always time to recover between scenes. Some days, the silence between takes is louder than anything written in the script, especially after the miracles, especially after the moments when Jesus touches someone's pain and lifts it. Jonathan says those scenes stay with him. Healing the leper, feeding the 5,000. Those aren't just Bible stories. They're deeply human moments, and he stands in the middle of them, with everyone looking to him to set the tone. But when the cameras stop, where does all that weight go? Sometimes the quiet after the scene is the heaviest part, and no moment illustrates that more than the private scene with Mary Magdalene. No crowd, no miracle, just raw conversation, vulnerable, quiet, real. It was one of the most tender scenes in the season, and it broke something open. Not just for Jonathan, for the entire cast. Because when the miracles pause and the silence speaks, that's when the story cuts the deepest. Even the crew people who've seen dozens of takes who live behind the lens found themselves caught off guard. And that's when you know, this isn't just a show, it's something more. Because true impact doesn't always come from big speeches or miraculous scenes. Sometimes it's in a glance, a pause, a silent moment between characters who've walked through seasons of grief, doubt, and faith together. Jonathan once said, "There's a sacredness in the stillness." The pauses between words can sometimes carry more weight than any monologue, and it's not just on set where that weight lingers. For Jonathan, it follows him home. The long days, the emotionally draining scenes, the sacred words of Scripture, it all begins to bleed into his everyday life. Prayer and preparation are no longer separate disciplines. They've become one. When he learns lines, he's also meditating. When he rehearses, he's listening not just to the words, but to what God might be saying through them. Somewhere along the way, the line between performance and prayer blurred. And he's okay with that, because sometimes the script feels like liturgy. Sometimes the words echo prayers he's whispered in real life. And when that overlap happens, it's not just good writing, it's personal. But with that depth comes a strange tension. It's a question no one wants to ask out loud, but it lingers in the background. What happens when people start to confuse the actor with the role? Jonathan knows it happens. He's felt it. People approach him with tears in their eyes, seeing not Jonathan, but Jesus. It's humbling, it's moving, but it's also hard. Because he knows he's human. He has bad days. He gets tired. He wrestles with doubt like anyone else. And no one, not even the most committed actor, can carry the perfection of the one he's portraying. He doesn't try to. Instead, he carries that awareness with humility. He never wants to stand in the way of the message. But he also wants people to remember he's a vessel, not the source. That's why he keeps his faith walk honest, not polished, not overly spiritual, just real. Because real faith, it's messy. And sometimes the holiest thing you can do is admit when you're overwhelmed, uncertain, or just plain tired. One of the most beautiful, often overlooked parts of The Chosen is what's happening off camera. The cast. They're not just co-workers. They've become something more, a family. When you spend months together filming scenes that deal with grief, loss, betrayal, and redemption, something shifts. You start to carry each other's burdens. You learn each other's rhythms. You don't just act together, you grow together. At some point, you stop pretending and start feeling. Jonathan often talks about how much the other actors bring. It's not just talent, it's presence. Liz Tabish, who plays Mary Magdalene, doesn't perform her role. She disappears into it. You watch her, and you believe. Noah James as Andrew carries a quiet intensity that gives every scene depth even when he barely speaks. And George Harrison Xanthus, always reminding everyone to stay grounded even as the show gets bigger and the pressure grows heavier. They check on each other, they pray together, and sometimes they just sit in silence. No words, just the weight of what they've walked through settling in. It's in those moments that The Chosen stops being a production. It becomes a fellowship. This season especially tested that bond. The crucifixion looms in the distance and its shadow touches every scene. Even the joyful moments carry a trace of what's coming. That anticipation creeps in, into the performances, into the atmosphere, into the actors' hearts. Jonathan admitted that some scenes weren't just hard, they were impossible to rehearse. How do you prepare to carry a cross, both literally and emotionally? How do you rehearse a heartbreak you already know will devastate everyone watching? Sometimes you don't. You just show up and let it break you, because if it breaks you in the right way, maybe it'll reach someone else. Jonathan called it carrying the cross before the cross. There's a kind of fatigue that goes beyond physical. When you spend months embodying someone who gives everything, who is misunderstood at every turn, it starts to wear on you. By the second half of season 5, Jonathan wasn't just tired. He was soul tired. He poured himself into every frame, not just as an actor, but as someone trying to honor what the role means. He said he tried to ground his performance in the rhythm of the liturgy because these episodes aren't just leading toward the crucifixion. They're soaked in the weight of it. Even though the cross hasn't appeared on screen yet, its shadow is in every frame, in every glance between the disciples, in every quiet evening on set, as Jesus Jonathan wasn't just preparing for death, he was feeling it. It's like grieving something that hasn't happened yet but knowing it will, and still choosing to love through it anyway. That changes you. The cast didn't just stay in one place either. Filming moved them from rural roads to wide open deserts. One day they were in Texas, another standing beneath the unforgiving sun in Utah, robes clinging to them heavier than they looked. But some of those locations didn't feel like sets. They felt sacred. There was one day Jonathan remembered in particular. He was filming a scene, Jesus preaching on a hill. The wind picked up. The sun caught the grass just right, and the extras, every one of them, stood in perfect silence. No one told them to. They just felt it, and so did he. Later, Jonathan said something simple but profound. It felt more like a pilgrimage than a production day. And those kinds of moments, they don't happen often. But when they do, they stay with you. Because at this point, The Chosen isn't just a show, it's a movement. And Jonathan has a front row seat to what it's doing in people's lives. At premieres, meetups, special screenings, he meets people forever changed by what they've seen. Some come out of addiction. Some return to faith after decades of silence. Some watch the show during the final weeks of a loved one's life. And some approach him trembling, tears already falling before a single word is spoken. And in those moments, he's never quite sure. Are they seeing Jonathan or are they seeing Jesus? But maybe that's not the point. Because something sacred is happening either way. He listens, he hugs them. Sometimes, he just stands in silence. Because there are no words when someone says a single scene helped them forgive a parent, or find hope after a suicide attempt. That's not a role anymore. That's a responsibility. And it becomes real again and again. Now don't get the wrong idea. The set doesn't feel like a church service. No one's quoting scripture between takes or passing around offering plates. But there's reverence. There's respect. This isn't just storytelling, it's sacred ground. Because this wasn't just a week of emotional scenes. It was a week full of holy moments. Moments where even the actors couldn't tell where the performance ended and the spiritual experience began. Between filming The Last Supper and the entry into Jerusalem, something shifted. The cast wasn't just acting anymore. They were living it, carrying the weight of every step, every word, every miracle. Tears weren't rare. And they didn't come from stress. They came from something deeper, because something sacred had settled on that set, and everyone felt it. Moments like that don't happen on cue, but when they do, they leave a mark. And for Jonathan Roumie, that mark was unmistakable. This was never just about playing Jesus. It was about encountering him, and no rehearsal, no retake, no line reading could prepare him for that. What happened on set didn't just bring history to life. It touched the hearts of those telling the story. It changed them, and it lingers still. So we'll leave you with this. What do you think is behind the depth of emotion the cast experienced? Could it be more than just acting? Is there something sacred stirring beneath the surface? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below.